The United States was only 38 years old when its capital was left completely defenseless. No walls, no army, no plan. On one night in 1814, Washington came closer to destruction than at any other moment in American history. Washington City was never meant to be a battlefield. In the early summer of 1814, it barely felt like a capital at all. The streets were dusty and unfinished, the buildings widely spaced. The grand vision of a federal city, still more dream than reality. The White House stood pale and proud on its hill. The Capitol rose unfinished, with scaffolding clinging to its walls, and beyond them stretched farmland, marsh, and forest. This was the symbolic heart of a young nation, but symbol was almost all it had. No fortifications ringed the city. No walls protected it, and on many nights, there wasn't even a full garrison to defend it. For decades, Americans had believed geography itself would shield them. Oceans had kept Europe at bay before. Distance had always been their ally. But in 1814, that comforting illusion was about to collapse. The United States was fighting a war it never truly expected to escalate. What began as a political gamble in 1812 had turned into a grinding, exhausting conflict against the most powerful empire on Earth. Britain, locked in a life-or-death struggle with Napoleon, initially treated the American war as a sideshow. Its best troops were fighting across Europe. Its navy, though dominant, was stretched thin, enforcing blockades and battling French fleets. For a time, this imbalance gave Americans hope. Victories on the frontier, survival at sea, and sheer stubbornness convinced many that the young republic could stand toe-to-toe with the British Empire. But wars change when circumstances change, and in the spring of 1814, everything did. Napoleon fell, Europe exhaled, and Britain, suddenly unburdened, turned its full attention westward. Veteran regiments hardened by years of brutal continental warfare boarded ships bound for North America. These were not colonial troops or militia. These were professionals who had marched across Europe, who had faced artillery barrages, cavalry charges, and desperate last stands. When they arrived, the balance of power shifted almost overnight. Along the American coastline, British ships multiplied. Ports tightened under blockade. Fear began to spread inland. Yet Washington still felt strangely untouched. Many believed the capital was too insignificant, too impractical a target. Baltimore, New York, Boston, those made sense. Washington did not. That belief would prove disastrously wrong. In the halls of government, complacency mixed with denial. President James Madison understood the danger in theory, but even he struggled to convince others that the capital itself might be threatened. Secretary of War John Armstrong was particularly dismissive. He argued that Washington held no strategic value, that the British would never waste men and resources marching inland simply to burn buildings. Armstrong insisted Baltimore was the real target, and much of the nation's defensive planning followed that assumption. Troops were misallocated, supplies were delayed. Intelligence reports warning of British movement up the Chesapeake were downplayed or ignored. The capital remained exposed not because Americans lacked courage, but because they lacked imagination. They could not conceive that their enemy would dare strike at the very symbol of American sovereignty. As summer wore on, the Chesapeake Bay became a highway for British warships. Coastal towns were raided. Plantations burned. Panic rippled through Maryland and Virginia. Refugees fled inland, with stories of red-coated soldiers and naval bombardments. Still, Washington waited. The city had no standing army to speak of. Its defense relied on hastily assembled militia units, farmers, clerks, shopkeepers, many with little training and even less confidence. They were brave men, but bravery alone does not stop a veteran army. When orders finally came to assemble a defensive force, confusion reigned. Units arrived late. Officers argued over rank. Supplies were scarce. Coordination was almost non-existent. And all the while, British troops were moving closer. By August, British commanders had chosen their target. Major General Robert Ross and Rear Admiral George Cockburn saw opportunity where American leaders saw impossibility. Washington was not heavily defended. Its capture would strike directly at American morale, Burning the Capitol would be a psychological blow felt far beyond the battlefield. It would humiliate the United States in the eyes of the world and potentially force negotiations on British terms. This was not about territory, it was about symbolism, about proving that the Republic was vulnerable, about reminding the former colonies that the empire they had once defied still possessed overwhelming power. The march toward Washington began quietly. British forces landed along the Patuxent River and advanced inland with speed and discipline. They faced little resistance at first. American scouts reported movements, but the information moved slowly, tangled in bureaucracy and disbelief. Some still insisted the British were bluffing. Others believed the capital could be defended at the last moment if necessary. Meanwhile, civilians in Washington began to sense the truth. Government officials packed documents. Families prepared to flee. Madison, the First Lady, famously refused to abandon the White House until critical state papers and national treasures were secured. Her calm resolve stood in stark contrast to the panic spreading through the city. As British troops advanced, the American defensive line finally formed near the small town of Bladensburg, just northeast of Washington. It was an awkward position, hastily chosen, poorly prepared. The militia dug shallow trenches and positioned artillery with limited coordination. Heat hung heavy in the August air. Many soldiers had marched for hours without adequate water. Commanders argued even as the enemy approached. When the British appeared, advancing with confidence and precision, the disparity became immediately clear. This was not a skirmish. It was a test the Americans were not ready to pass. The Battle of Bladensburg unfolded quickly and disastrously. British artillery opened fire. Rockets streaked across the sky, unfamiliar and terrifying to the militia. Lines wavered. Then they broke. Men fled in confusion, some dropping weapons, others running without orders. Attempts to rally them failed. Only a few units held briefly before being overwhelmed. President Madison himself was present, witnessing the collapse firsthand. It was chaos. What should have been a defensive stand became a rout, so complete that it would later earn a bitter nickname, the Bladensburg Races. Within hours, the road to Washington lay open. As the sun began to set, British troops marched toward the undefended capital. There would be no second line of defense, no hidden fortifications, no reinforcements riding to the rescue. Washington City was alone. Government officials fled in all directions. Some crossed the Potomac, others hid in nearby towns. The capital of the United States was abandoned by its own leadership, not out of cowardice, but necessity. To stay would have meant capture, and capture could mean the end of the government itself. Night fell as British soldiers entered the city. They marched past empty streets, silent buildings, symbols of a nation suddenly powerless. The White House stood dark. The Capitol loomed unfinished and exposed. There were no cheers, no resistance, only the heavy sound of boots on stone and dirt. Orders were given, torches were lit, and soon, flames would rise high enough to be seen for miles. This was the moment America would remember, or barely survive. The first fires were deliberate. British officers moved methodically, selecting targets not for tactical value but for meaning. Government buildings were their objective, not private homes. This was punishment, not plunder. Orders were given to spare civilians where possible, but to erase the symbols of American authority. Torches were carried into the Capitol first. The building was still unfinished, its chambers raw and exposed, but it represented the legislative heart of the Republic. As flames caught, wooden beams crackled, and marble walls blackened. The Library of Congress burned with thousands of volumes consumed in minutes. Knowledge, law, and ambition vanished in smoke that curled into the night sky. From there, the troops moved toward the president's house. The White House had been evacuated only hours earlier. Dinner had been set, then abandoned. Madison had fled at the last moment, carrying with her Gilbert Stuart's portrait of George Washington, refusing to let the image of the nation's founder fall into enemy hands. When British soldiers arrived, They found the building eerily intact, its rooms silent, its symbols untouched. They ate what food remained, then carried out their orders. Flames climbed the walls, devouring the interior, bursting through windows, turning the pale stone structure into a blazing monument of humiliation. The fire spread across the city. The treasury, the war office, the navy yard, all were set alight. Explosions rocked the air as gunpowder stores ignited. Heat distorted the night, turning streets into corridors of flame. For Washington's few remaining residents, the scene was surreal. Some watched from hiding. Others fled farther into the countryside, carrying with them the knowledge that their capital being erased before their eyes. For a nation barely a generation old, it felt like the end of an experiment. British commanders did not linger out of arrogance or triumph. They knew the risk of staying. American resistance, though shattered, could reform. Reinforcements might arrive. Disease was always a threat in the humid summer air. Their mission was not occupation, it was demonstration. By dawn, the message would be clear to the world. The United States could be struck at its core. As fires continued to burn through the night, an unexpected force intervened. A violent storm rolled over the city. Winds howled. Rain fell in torrents. Some accounts spoke of a tornado tearing through Washington, scattering troops and extinguishing flames. Whether tornado or tempest, the storm was real, and its impact undeniable. Fires were smothered. Roofs collapsed. The destruction halted as suddenly as it had begun. By morning, the British withdrew. They marched out of the city, blackened, broken, and stunned, leaving behind ruins and questions that would haunt Americans for generations. Washington had fallen not because it was weak in spirit, but because it had been unprepared in reality. The psychological damage was immense. News spread rapidly. Newspapers struggled to describe the event without sounding like obituaries. Foreign powers took note. If Britain could burn the American capital, what else could it do? Confidence wavered. Fear crept into political debate. Had independence been a mistake? Had the Republic grew too fast, too sure of itself? President Madison returned to a capital in ashes. The White House was a hollow shell, its walls scorched, its interior destroyed. The Capitol stood blackened and skeletal. Government resumed operations in borrowed spaces, meeting rooms, private homes, wherever walls still stood. Yet amid the devastation, something unexpected began to form. Rage replaced despair. Shame hardened into resolve. The attack on Washington, intended to break American will, instead clarified it. Survival was no longer abstract. It was personal. Militia units reassembled. Baltimore braced itself. Fort McHenry prepared for siege. When the British turned their attention there, they faced a city ready to fight. The failed defense of Washington had taught brutal lessons, and those lessons were applied quickly. In September, as British ships bombarded the fort, the American flag still flew at dawn. The war's momentum shifted not because Washington burned, but because Americans refused to let that be the final chapter. The Capitol would be rebuilt. The White House would rise again, its scars hidden beneath fresh stone. The Capitol would be completed, grander than before. But the memory of that night would never fully fade. It lingered as a warning that symbols mean nothing without protection, that ideals require vigilance, and that survival is never guaranteed. Even for a nation convinced of its destiny, Washington had almost fallen. And in that near collapse, the United States discovered what it truly meant to endure. In the days that followed, Washington felt less like a capital and more like a graveyard of ambition. Smoke still lingered in the air, clinging to scorched stone and charred wood. The smell of burned paper and wet ash hung over the city, a reminder that the symbols of the Republic had proven frighteningly fragile. Citizens returned cautiously, stepping through streets littered with debris, staring at buildings that once represented permanence and now stood hollowed and blackened. The shock was not just physical destruction, it was psychological. For the first time since independence, Americans were forced to confront the idea that their nation might not survive its own youth. Internationally, the consequences were immediate. European observers watched closely. Monarchies that had doubted the American experiment now felt vindicated. A republic that could not defend its capital, critics argued, was not destined to last. British newspapers celebrated the burning as justice for American raids in Canada. Diplomats weighed whether the United States should be treated as a serious power or a temporary rebellion that had simply gone on too long. The humiliation cut deeply because it was public. Empires rarely admit weakness, but the United States had been exposed before the entire world. Inside the country, anger and blame spread quickly. Who had failed? The War Department came under fire, its misjudgments laid bare. John Armstrong's insistence that Washington was not a target now seemed disastrously naive. He resigned under pressure, a casualty of political reality as much as military failure. But one man did not erase the truth. The disaster had systemic. The nation had underestimated its enemy, overestimated its own security, and confused ideals with preparation. The war had stripped away the illusion that freedom alone was a shield. Yet, even as Washington lay wounded, something fundamental began to shift. The burning of the Capitol did not trigger collapse. It triggered resolve. Across the states, recruitment surged. Militias reorganized. Command structures tightened. The war was no longer an abstract political disagreement over trade rights or impressment. It was personal. British soldiers had walked through the halls of American power. They had eaten in the president's house. They had set fire to the future. That memory burned hotter than any building ever could. Nowhere was this resolve more visible than in Baltimore. Unlike Washington, Baltimore prepared. Fortifications were strengthened. Civilians assisted in building defenses. When British forces returned weeks later, confident after their success in the capital, they encountered resistance unlike anything they had faced in the campaign. Fort McHenry stood firm under relentless bombardment. Rockets lit the night sky once more, but this time the defenders held. When dawn broke and the American flag still flew, it sent a signal far beyond the harbor. The Republic had learned. It would not break twice. That moment echoed outward. Morale surged. The war, which had seemed lost only weeks earlier, took on new life. Though the conflict would continue into 1815, the destruction of Washington marked a turning point not because it weakened America, but because it hardened it. The capital had burned, but the idea behind it had survived intact. In some ways, it had been tested and proven stronger. As peace negotiations progressed in Europe, American diplomats carried a different posture. They spoke not as representatives of a defeated nation, but as survivors who had endured humiliation and refused to yield. The Treaty of Ghent would eventually end the war without territorial loss for the United States. Britain achieved none of its grand aims. The war concluded not with conquest, but with exhaustion, and mutual recognition that neither side could decisively dominate the other. When Washington was rebuilt, the decision to restore the capital rather than relocate it was deeply symbolic. Some argued the city was too vulnerable, too poorly positioned. Others insisted that abandoning it would mean surrendering to fear. In the end, Washington remained. The White House was repaired and painted white, not to hide burn marks, but to assert continuity. The Capitol rose again, larger and more imposing, a declaration that the Republic would not retreat from its own vision. But memory lingered beneath the stone. The night Washington almost fell became a quiet lesson embedded in the nation's identity. It taught future leaders that power invites challenge, that youth invites testing, and that survival is never guaranteed by belief alone. Every later crisis, civil war, global conflict, internal division carried echoes of 1814. The lesson was simple and unforgiving. Ideals must be defended, not assumed. The British had intended to end something that night. Instead, they had helped shape it. The flames that consumed Washington illuminated a truth that would define the United States going forward. This was not a nation protected by destiny. It was a nation that would have to fight, adapt, and endure to exist at all. With time, the scars of 1814 faded from the city's surface, but they remained etched into the country's instincts. Washington rebuilt not just its buildings, but its assumptions. The idea that distance alone could protect the nation quietly died in the ashes. In its place emerged a harder understanding of power. Standing armies, coastal defenses, and professional command structures were no longer seen as threats to liberty, but as necessities for survival. The Republic had learned, painfully, that ideals without force were invitations to challenge. The memory of the burning shaped American strategy for generations. Fortifications expanded along the coast. Military planning became more centralized. The federal government gained authority not by ambition, but by necessity. The night Washington almost forced Americans to confront a contradiction at the heart of their revolution. They had rebelled against empire, yet now found themselves required to act like one in order to endure. Power, they realized, was not a moral failing. It was a tool. Dangerous if abused, fatal if ignored. For men and women who lived through it, the event never became abstract history. They remembered the glow on the horizon, the sound of collapsing roofs, the feeling of helplessness, as symbols they had trusted burned without resistance. Survivors told stories to their children not to glorify the moment, but to warn against complacency. The Capitol was no longer just a seat of government, it was proof of vulnerability. And that vulnerability became a quiet motivator behind every later effort to defend it. Foreign powers took notice as well. Britain never attempted a similar strike again. The message had been delivered, but so had the response. The United States had absorbed the blow and emerged intact. Other nations adjusted their calculations. The Republic might be young, but it was not fragile. It could lose its capital and still function. That resilience would become one of America's defining traits, tested repeatedly across the centuries. Yet, the question lingered beneath the triumph. What if the British had stayed longer? What if the storm had not come? What if Washington had been occupied instead of burned and abandoned? The answers remain unknowable, but the implications are clear. The United States stood closer to collapse in August 1814 than most Americans ever realize. There was no backup capital prepared, no secure line of command. The government survived because it moved quickly, improvised, and refused to surrender legitimacy, even while scattered across the countryside. In that sense, the survival of the Republic rested less on military success than on continuity. Laws continued to function. Authority remained recognized. The idea of the United States endured even when its physical center did. That endurance became the nation's true strength, not the buildings, not the armies, but the collective refusal to accept that destruction equaled defeat. As decades passed, Washington transformed from a vulnerable symbol into a fortified center of power. The memory of fire drove the desire for permanence. Stone replaced wood. Distance was replaced by defense. And with each new layer of security, the lesson of 1814 grew quieter, fading into textbooks and footnotes. But it never disappeared entirely. It resurfaced whenever danger approached the capital, whenever the unthinkable seemed suddenly possible again. The night Washington almost fell was not the end of the American story. It was the moment the story hardened, the moment innocence burned away, the moment the Republic realized that survival was not guaranteed by ideals alone, but earned through preparation, unity, and resolve. The morning after the flames died, Washington stood silent. Ash settled on broken streets. Walls still smoked. The capital, the United States, looked less like the center of a nation and more like a warning left behind by history. Yet beneath the ruin, something remarkable had happened. The Republic had survived its most humiliating night. No surrender had been signed. No authority had collapsed. The government returned bruised but unbroken, and with it returned the belief that the nation could endure even the unthinkable. In the years that followed, the story of that night quietly reshaped how Americans understood themselves. The burning of Washington was rarely celebrated, rarely spoken of with pride, but it became a test the country had passed. Not through victory, but through survival. The lesson was uncomfortable, and that is why it mattered. It taught that power is fragile, that symbols can fall, and that continuity, the decision to carry on, is what separates collapse from endurance. When the White House was rebuilt, it was not just repaired, it was reaffirmed. The same was true of the Capitol. Rising again from blackened stone, it became a statement that the Republic would not be erased by fire. Over time, the night faded into the background of larger wars and greater struggles. Civil war, global conflict, and internal division would later threaten the nation in far more devastating ways. But each time, the memory of 1814 lingered beneath the surface. It whispered a warning. It reminded leaders that no nation is immune to shock, and no capital is beyond reach. That reminder shaped how America prepared, how it defended itself, and how it understood the cost of complacency. The British never returned to burn Washington again. The world changed. Empires rose and fell. The United States grew from a fragile republic into a global power. Yet its capital still stands on ground, once walked by enemy soldiers, its walls once blackened by foreign fire. That history remains embedded in the city itself, invisible to most but foundational to its existence. The night Washington almost fell was not a story of defeat. It was a story of exposure, a moment when illusion burned away and reality took its place. The United States learned that survival is not guaranteed by belief alone, and that the strength of a nation lies not in its monuments, but in its willingness to rebuild them. If you want more stories like this, moments when history balanced on a knife's edge, when the world nearly turned out very differently, make sure to subscribe. These aren't just stories about the past, they're reminders of how close everything we know once came to disappearing.